In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Chapter 6, Sex, Class, and Power in Victorian England. Now, 19th century reform movements were part of a growing middle-class response to widespread social and economic changes following the Industrial Revolution. An aristocratic and mercantile capitalism evolved into industrial capitalism. The middle class emerged as the dominant political and social force. In America, the abolition, temperance, and suffrage movements profoundly influenced the lives of middle and upper class women aspiring to become have professional careers in the arts. However, we're going to start with Victorian England. Anatomy, physiology, and biblical authority were repeatedly invoked to prove that the ideal of modest and pure womanhood that evolved during Queen Victoria's reign, which was from 1837 to 1901, was based on sound psychological principles. It was widely believed that too much book learning decreased femininity. Exposure to the nude model was thought to inflame the passions and disturb the control of female sexuality that lay at the heart of Victorian moral injunctions. Nudity, exposure to women of questionable virtue who worked as models, stimulation of the senses. At issue here was power over female sexuality, itself a recurring motif in 19th century art and literature. And here we have again the woman question, basically what's to be done with women, that we talked about earlier in the semester in the Nochlin piece. Some of the questions asked were, what capabilities did women have? What was the natural expression of femininity in art, and in which gender was organized around an ideological separation of spheres for men and women, meaning men and women were kept completely separate. Also, we had the cult of true womanhood, but this was a double-edged sword. Women were presented as morally and spiritually superior to men, and given primary responsibility for managing the home, but their lives were restricted in many other ways. The middle-class ideal of femininity stigmatized many groups of women as deviant, those who remained unmarried, who worked, or were slaves, or immigrants, or social radicals. However, many middle-class women found positive identities in sisterhood, celibacy, and female partnership. Recent work by social historians has emphasized the positive aspects of the separation of the sexes, specifically the deep friendships and community of purpose that developed among women. By the second half of the century, the feminine ideal was being challenged on both sides of the Atlantic. Economic realities and a growing realization that many women in the new industries were working under deplorable conditions intensified the demands for reform by middle-class women. Women artists existed in a contradictory relationship, though, to the prevailing middle-class ideals of femininity. They were caught between a social ideology that prohibited the individual competition and public visibility necessary for success in the arts, and the educational social reform movements that made the 19th century the greatest period of female social progress in history. The qualities which define the artist, independence, self-reliance, and competitiveness, belong to a male sphere of influence and actions. Women who adopted these traits risked being labeled as sexual deviants. Art reviews from the period are full of charges that aspiring women artists risk unsexing themselves. Though during Victoria's reign, the status of women did change dramatically. In 1837, married women had very few legal rights. However, the Divorce Act of 1857, the publication of the Subjection of Women in 1869, the Married Woman's Property Act of 1870, and the Matrimonial Causes of 1884 were all milestones on the way to legal protection for women outside marriage. However, Victorian painting emphasizes the romantic, sentimental, and moralizing aspects of everyday life. Wider opportunities for exhibiting artworks by women accompanied expanded art education for women, but it did not solve the problems of access to official institutions and equal opportunity. As women began to press for the training that would enable them to compete as professional artists, their struggle became part of the larger drive for educational reform. Beginning in the 1840s, schools were founded to provide training in design for women who were forced to support themselves. However, they almost all stress suitable areas for women to train in. The association of women with these areas of production, as well as their continuing educational segregation, fueled charges that art by women was mediocre. In Britain, as in America, women often worked together, sharing models and experience, and often commemorating each other and the members of their households in paintings. So while we're seeing this kind of bond between women develop more and a little bit more educational opportunities, by no means are women artists treated the same as men, and also they're still being judged, right, because they're being seen as, becoming too male, and that's becoming a sexual deviant. Between 1830 and 1849, paintings of domestic life, courtship, Christian values, and the dangers of transgressions confirmed widely held attitudes, but they did little to redirect attention of other areas of concern. In its adherence to ideologies of class and gender, that of others reveals a more skeptical attitude and a desire to renegotiate the terms of feminine dependency. The enshrinement of the Victorian middle-class woman at home contributed to the pictorial celebration of the Madonna-like women and to an emphasis on the stages of women's lives through which femininity is defined and secured. In paintings such as the one shown here, this is Charles West Cope's Life Well Spent from 1862, stresses women as nurturers and caregivers. The removal of women to the private sphere of the family made scenes of family life seem particularly appropriate for women artists. However, images such as these do not express a single unified attitude of a feminine point of view. Other paintings by women address the uneasy aspects of feminine sexuality, constructed around male protection and approval, and domestic and family pleasures. The ideal of the clean, well-ordered Victorian home resisted representations of the physical labor required to efface dirt and maintain the leisure of the upper and middle class families. So while we're showing these clean and well-kept homes, we're never showing the women actually doing the work. And that's going to bring us to working class women. Although they do not appear frequently in paintings, the physical presence of servants in the home made them readily available as subjects for women artists. Representations give dignity and presence to working class women within a set of middle class expectations about domestic labor. Why female servants protected richer women from domestic drudgery and physical labor, other women, the majority of them underpaid and forced to work in unhealthy or dangerous conditions, supported the British economy. After 1841, the situation of female factory and mill workers formed a major subject of public debate. However, their plight rarely enters the art of the period before the 1850s. Representations of governesses, one of the few paid occupations open to middle-class women, do exist. By 1851, there are around 25,000 governesses in Britain. However, within the tightly structured Victorian world of home and family, they had no secure place. Also, we see some of the working class women represented in the works of female artists, as you can see here on the image on the left. This is Emily Marie Osborne's Nameless and Friendless from 1857. Here she shows the female artist, but it's a young boy showing the dealer her work. The dealer shows his contempt, and the other men look at her as an object and not artist. They're not interested in her art, but they're interested in her. The painting is carefully structured to emphasize the commodification of women in the art trade and the isolation and helplessness of the single woman in patriarchal society. The message here is clear. Women have no place in the commerce of art. They belong in the world of art as subjects, not as makers or purveyors. We also see the plight of working class women in the painting on the right. This is Seamstress by Anna Blunden from 1854. Here we're looking at the poor working conditions and long hours she has. We're seeing here she's labored overnight working on a man's shirt, showing that this is long and laborious activity. However, middle and upper class reformers generally directed their energy toward improving working conditions rather than ending this kind of exploitive labor. The theme of women's labor intersects with that of female equality and men's control over the bodies of women. It has been argued that the stability of the Victorian household rested in part on the existence of prostitutes. The purity and morality of the middle-class woman was defined in opposition to the immorality of the prostitute. Depictions of prostitutes in painting began to increase, peaking in the 1850s and 1860s. In an age obsessed with virginity and prostitution, themes of the prostitute and the fallen woman found a very wide audience. However, in contrast to the many depictions of fallen women by male painters, we have only a description of a single work by a female painter. Images of prostitution focus attention on one of the most complex and ambivalent aspects of Victorian thought, the attitude to female sexuality. Now, what's also interesting is few subjects in painting drew in as large an audience or were as widely reproduced as those pertaining to animals. Large segments of Victorian society held a special place in their hearts for domesticated animals. Also, images of animals frequently symbolized the vices and virtues of women. They were constantly exhorted to rise above their animal natures. Women were also then pursued by these animal examples. And we're going to talk again here about Rosa Bonheur. We talked about her earlier in the Nauckland piece. Again, she was the most famous artist of the 19th century and one of the most admired animal painters in history. She was born in Bordeaux, France in 1822. Her mother, who died when she was 11, taught her to read, draw, and play the piano. And her father, like many other artists we've seen, was a minor artist and supervised her artistic training. She's largely considered an anomaly among women artists of her day. And we've already talked about her dress and appearance in the Nauckland piece, so I'm not going to go into it again here. She was considered radical in her personal life, but artistically and politically she was pretty conservative. She came to England in 1856 following the success of her painting The Horse Fair in 1855, which is the bottom image here. Her critical reputation grew slowly but steadily throughout the 1840s. Her greatest success before the Horse Fair is plowing in the Nirvanis from 1848, which is the top image shown. She emphasized the nobility of laboring animals against a broad expanse of sky painted with the light and clarity of Dutch 17th century painting. The Horse Fair became one of the best known and loved of all 19th century paintings. Her paintings appealed to the British middle class audiences. Her fame in Britain also coincided with a period of impassioned public debate about animal rights and animal abuse around the issue of vivisection, which that's actually performing surgeries on alive, awake animals. So the same images which expose the helplessness of animals were used to reinforce the subordinate imperative position of women in relation to the institutes of male power and privilege. Bonheur's horses and dogs emphasize the animals' freedom and uncorrupted nature, their loyalty, courage, and grace. In a curious way, middle-class Victorian women's love for animals and the widespread involvement of working-class men and women in the animal rights movement forged an unusual bond between the classes. The issue was power, or rather their powerlessness that middle-class women and the working-class men and women experienced in the face of the institutionalized authority of middle and upper-class men. During the 19th century, the new medical science of gynecology also removed much of women's health care from midwives' hands, placing women's bodies under the control of male doctors and submitting women to the horror of early gynecological practices. We also have the book Black Beauty, which was published in 1877 by Anna Sewell. This provided one focus for equating the situation of women with that of animals. Black Beauty is in fact a feminist tract deploring the cruel oppression of all creatures, especially women in the working class. Black Beauty is the horse, is both a working animal at the mercy of owners who range from kind to cruel, and a beautiful piece of property, much like that of a wife. The book at its time was very immensely popular. All right, now we're going to look at another female artist that was successful in her time. And this is Elizabeth Thompson. Her date's 1846 to 1933. Here, Chapman claims her paintings must be read as a part of middle and upper class effort to assert control, in this case over the British Army. She refused to be restricted to feminine subjects, and she painted the world of war and soldiers' lives, a world which was understood to belong to men. She also experienced dazzling success for a brief period. She has been called the first painter to celebrate the courage and endurance of the ordinary British soldier. Now, she also came from a wealthy and privileged background, and her father believed in female education and development. She began training in oil paint in 1862 with William Standish in London. Her choice of military history as a subject is both a mark of her ambition and her realization that the subject was non-exploited in British painting. Here we see one of her most famous works, The Calling of the Roll After an Engagement, Crimea, 1874, and this work brought her instant success. It attracted huge audiences and propelled her to celebrity status. However, though, she wasn't celebrated so much as a female artist, but as an artist who transcended the limitations of her sex. The painting graphically depicts the Guards mustering after a battle in the Crimean War, which was from 1854 to 56. Some critics claim she had to have been a nurse to have witnessed such injury or illness. But then we begin to see her decline in popularity. Several factors lead to this declining fame, such as marriage, there was growing competition from other battle painters, and honestly just the issue of time. She was also busy raising 5 children. As a military wife, she did follow her husband to foreign postings, including areas such as Egypt within the continent of Africa and other places in Africa. And that brings us to the idea of Orientalism. The term has been used to refer to the way in which Europeans, many of them travelers, explorers, artists, and writers, imaginatively represented the Orient. In today's society, the term Orientalism is basically a negative. Why? It's a way of almost like whitewashing what was considered the Orient. As Linda Nochlin notes, often they brought forth 2 ideological assumptions about power. One about men's power over women, the other about white men's superiority to, and hence justifiable control over, inferior darker races. The representation and discursive strategies that created the imperial nation as masculine and the conquered colonized as imperialized and feminine implicate both race and gender in colonialist projects. Discourses of femininity, with their emphasis on passive pity and domesticity, coexisted uneasily with imperialism's demand for decisive action and intrepid, fearless behavior. These works remain complicit in the European imperialist period of constructing the Orient and conflating it with Oriental women. Now, we do see books illustrated with women's drawings in watercolors, some of them privately painted, begin to appear in the 1840s. Within these aristocratic collections contained little in the way of social commentary, but they offered fresh and often instructive glimpses into non-European lands. The Society of Female Artists, which encouraged both amateurs and professionals to exhibit, provided one of several important venues for women's work on themes of travel in the Orient. By the 1850s, feminists were using what they and their contemporaries viewed as Indian women's plight as an incentive for British women to work in the empire. Issues like the need for Indian female education soon expanded Victorian social reform to the colonies. Also, we see women's growing voice in public life also extended to reshaping the historical record. A number of other women turned to the writings of women and to history's heroic women for subjects that would enable them to enter the field of history painting. As we've discussed before, usually history painting would be something women were excluded from. So while women artists were seldom, if ever, given public commissions for history paintings, they nevertheless produced large and important works which proposed new readings of historical events. Often, they retold historical events from a woman's point of view, and other works reported women's support and friendship or their strength. However, not all women shared the ambition to paint what was considered masculine subjects. We see that here in Anna Lee Merritt's War from 1883. Merritt, like many other women in Victorian England, upheld the ideology of separate spheres for the sexes. Here she's showing the passivity of the idealized women on the balcony to the men of action parading below. It affirms the dominant view of acceptable femininity defined in terms of passivity and domesticity, while at the same time offering a critique of masculine enterprise. So we can see in Victorian England, we do see some reforms and some changes. However, often women, especially women artists, were still held to that standard, that by trying to be in the masculine field of art, that they were not being feminine, and in many ways were seen as deviant.